Today for youth, we're looking at Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 to 30. And when Kaz asked me to look at these verses, she wouldn't have known that these were some of my favourite verses as a teenager. And in fact, they are written in my sister's handwriting in the front of my Bible that I got at the time. And the verses that really stood out to me are the ones that talk about shining like stars in the universe as we hold out the word of life. And when I was 16, 17, those verses really gripped me and really inspired me. And I thought, that's what I want to give my life to. But those aren't the ones we're going to look at today. We're going to look a little bit earlier than that, where it talks about continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. And as we look at these verses, the first question to ask is, what is that all about? Why is Paul writing about fear and trembling to the Philippians church? That's not something we normally wake up and think, I'm going to go for a good bit of fear and trembling today. But as we look at other versions of the Bible, we get other ideas about what Paul is meaning there. And other versions talk about giving our full energy to following God, putting our time and our effort and our focus into it. And again, we can ask that question, why is Paul writing this to the Philippian church? And it's good to look at the bit we're looking at today, how it links with other bits of the letter to the Philippians, as Kaz encouraged us before to read it as one whole letter. And at the start of the bit we're looking at today, it says therefore. And one good bit of advice I was always given when you're reading the Bible is, what is the therefore? And it comes just after the bit where Paul is talking about Jesus' humility and how he gave up all his power to death on a cross for you and for me. And the bit later on from the verses that I've mentioned today gives the example of two people who've given their lives to humility, to serving Paul, to serving the church in Philippi, and to serving God. Maybe in a context when they could have been famous, when they could have had power, when they could have had authority. And they've given that all up to live the way that God's asking them to live. And this whole letter, this whole series that we're looking at, where it talks about life to the max and talking about living God's way, is about talking about living totally different from the culture around them for the Philippians. And it is similar for us today. The values that we've talked about, talking about humility, talking about finding contentment in what God's called us to. Paul talking about the advantage of being in prison for the gospel, for sharing about Jesus. These are very different from what the world then and what the world now is telling us to count as important. And this is why Paul, I think, is saying to the Philippians that you have to work at your salvation, you have to work at your relationship with God, you have to work at living as a Christian, because it's not easy when the world will be telling them and telling us to go after other things, to go after power, to go after fame, to go after authority, to go after popularity, to go after success. And also I think these are good verses of advice in hard times to work at your salvation. Paul was going through a hard time, he was in prison. The Philippian church was maybe going through a hard time as well. And for us in COVID times, to work out our salvation, to work at our relationship with God, when it can be so easy to feel frustrated at our situations, to maybe find it hard with homeschooling, maybe our families are doing our head in, maybe we're really frustrated about things we can't do. And it'd be very easy to either go along with what our friends are doing, or very easy to kick against God and to push away from him. And Paul's encouragement and my encouragement is to work at our relationship with God, to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. And what could that look like? Someone I know very well always says in any situation, well, I know God's good, I know God's character's good, so if the situation around me is really tough or really rubbish, I need to look for God's goodness. So in any situation, in any day, we can always ask ourselves that question. Where is God's goodness? Where is he being good in this? Where is he working out good things in homeschooling, in time with family, in maybe a quieter time, less busyness? What is the good that God is working out in this? And another question for us to consider is, what will that look like to work out our salvation with fear and trembling? Is it coming to youth, keeping connected in with community? Is it having a favourite Bible verse like I was talking about, reading that out over our lives, having it somewhere where we can remember it? We can get it into our hearts and our heads so it encourages us when things are tough. Is it a verse about peace? Is it one of God's other promises? Is it taking time as a family to chat about these verses in Philippians and seeing what they mean to us as a family? Is it taking time over Sunday lunch today? And the thing to remember is the next verse, is where it says, God is at work in us to will and to act according to his good purpose. And this isn't about us being cyborgs, about us being controlled, or about us being microchipped. As the Message version says, this is about God's energy, the Holy Spirit, being God's energy in us to help us to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, to help us to work out our relationship with God. We can't do it alone, and we're not meant to. We're not meant to do it in our own strength. It's tough trying to live God's way when the world is telling us to live differently. It's tough trying to live God's way when life is hard. But these verses encourage us to put our energy at it, but to know that we've got God's Spirit within us, that his energy is at work with us, encouraging us, working in us to live out God's way, no matter what else is going on.